Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today we're untangling a seriously fascinating web, how 1,500-year-old Christian concept somehow found its way right into the absolute center of modern American border politics. Whether you're a theology buff or just someone following politics, understanding this ancient philosophy is honestly key to decoding today's headlines.
To make sure we don't get lost in the weeds, here's our roadmap. We're going to trace J.D. Vance's path to Catholicism, define this concept of ordo amoris, see how it actually applies to border politics, and finally, unpack both the cultural critiques and the really intense theological debate surrounding it.
Starting right off with Section 1, Vance's path to Catholicism.
So commentators over at the Bulwark have pointed out that Vance's conversion was heavily influenced by a pretty profound distaste for the secular vibe of his Yale classmates. He felt really alienated by the arrogance of elite meritocracy and was looking for father figures. And notably, his journey was hugely shaped by his interactions with tech billionaire Peter Thiel. Vance described Thiel as openly Christian and incredibly intelligent, which apparently totally challenged Vance's previous assumption that all really smart people were just automatically atheists.
Now, this is where it gets interesting. Thiel actually introduced Vance to the French philosopher René Girard. Girard's writing specifically warned against authoritarian scapegoating. It's part of his broader mimetic theory that looks at how societies target minorities just to gain control. But what's striking here, and a point critics really hammer home, is that Girard meant this as a warning of what not to do. Critics argue Vance has basically inverted this in his political career, actively using the exact scapegoating tactics that Girard philosophically warned us about.
Moving right along to Section 2, defining ordo amoris.
Vance frequently points to this Latin phrase, ordo amoris, which literally translates to the order of love. This is a classic Christian framework developed way back by St. Augustine. Essentially, it describes how a person should properly scale their affections and moral duties, right? First toward God, then yourself, and then your neighbor. It's this highly structured way of figuring out exactly where our responsibilities lie when we're living in a world full of infinite need.
And Augustine added some really important nuance to this. He basically said, look, we should love all people equally as children of God, for sure. But we're finite creatures. We physically cannot help everyone on the planet. Because of that limitation, Augustine argued that providence dictates we often have to first take care of those who are geographically, temporally, or socially closest to us. We just have to prioritize based on the actual circumstances we find ourselves in.
Which brings us to Section 3, politics and the border.
In a high-profile Fox News interview with Sean Hannity, Vance actually used this ancient concept to defend an America First agenda, specifically when talking about severe restrictions on immigration and mass deportations. He laid out this strict hierarchy where your duty flows outward in very rigid steps. Family first, then your community, then your fellow citizens, and only lastly, after all those people are totally taken care of, the rest of the world.
Applying that framework, Vance argues that the political left has completely flipped this sacred order of love upside down. He actually called it a deranged compassion, arguing that his political opponents prioritize undocumented migrants, strangers living thousands of miles away, over the immediate needs of American families. In his view, prioritizing the global over the national is a direct, literal violation of this ancient moral order.
And that brings us to the core conflict of our explainer, forcing us to ask, does traditional Christian theology actually back up this strict, nation-first application of the order of love? Like, is this what Augustine really meant, or are we looking at a modern political distortion? Let's dive into Section 4, critiques of the narrative.
Folks over at the Bulwark podcast see some glaring contradictions here. They argue that while Vance claims to reject elite ambition in favor of traditional family values and localized love, his actual life choices kind of point the other way. I mean, he's aggressively pursued wealth and power, checking all the elite boxes across venture capital, Hollywood, the Senate, and the Vice Presidency. They also call out his rejection of modern therapy in his memoir, interpreting it as a refusal to engage in any genuine self-reflection.
And they go even further, suggesting he instrumentalizes his faith. Basically, they argue he uses concepts like Catholic guilt and the sacrament of confession not as tools for real accountability, but almost like a protective shield. In their view, he's adopting the aesthetic of religious conversion to avoid taking genuine responsibility for the real-world harm caused by his political rhetoric against vulnerable populations.
Let's pivot away from political pundits for Section 5, the theological debate. Writing in the Journal of Moral Theology, a scholar named Stephen Pope took a really deep dive into this exact controversy, and his conclusion is pretty blunt. He argues that Vance has fundamentally misunderstood and, frankly, misrepresented the actual teachings of both St. Augustine and Thomas Aquinas.
Academic theologians point out that Vance is treating the order of love like a closed set of concentric circles. A rigid system where you protect your own tribe first and only move outward when it's convenient. But the traditional Augustinian and Thomistic models, they say love should expand outward like a fire. And crucially, traditional theology incorporates the concept of need. It argues that absolute priority absolutely must sometimes be given to the urgent, life-or-death needs of a total stranger, even over the minor everyday conveniences of your own family or nation.
Building right on that, modern Catholic social teaching flat-out rejects Vance's worldview. The tradition leans heavily on two major principles. First, the universal destination of goods, which is this radical idea that the world's resources ultimately belong to everyone to sustain human flourishing. And second, the principle of deep cross-border solidarity. In this context, solidarity isn't just a vague feeling of sympathy. It's a firm, demanding commitment to the common good, meaning wealthy nations have an obligation to help vulnerable people, regardless of where the borders are drawn.
This debate actually went all the way to the top of the church. Pope Francis directly pushed back on Vance's framework in a letter to U.S. bishops. He explicitly stated that Christian love is not just some concentric expansion of interests that prioritizes the self and the nation first. He condemned the policies of mass deportation, arguing that a true common good means we have to welcome, protect, and integrate the most fragile members of the human family, entirely regardless of their nationality.
So as we wrap up this explainer, having looked at the ancient origins of ordo amoris, how it's being used in modern politics today, and the pretty rigorous theological pushback, we're going to leave you with this final thing to chew on. If true moral duty is actually measured by urgent human need rather than just national borders, how should a wealthy society truly order its love today? Thanks for exploring this with us.